Hello, and welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we delve into the space between sleep and reality, where the lines blur and the heart finds what it's looking for, or perhaps, what it's hiding from. This is the story of a woman, a dream, and a stranger who felt more real than life itself. This is Chapter 1 of The Stranger I See in My Dreams. The rain in Seattle has a sound all its own. It's not the violent downpour of a summer storm or the gentle pitter-patter of a spring shower. It's a persistent, steady hiss, a constant companion that blankets the city in a perpetual state of gray melancholy. For Evelyn Reed, or Evie as her friends called her, that sound was the soundtrack to her life. It was the white noise that filled the silence of her small one-bedroom apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, a space filled with half-finished canvases, the scent of turpentine, and the quiet hum of a refrigerator that had seen better days. Evie was a graphic designer, a job that paid the bills but did little to ignite the passion that once burned in her. Her true art, the vibrant and chaotic painting she created for herself, lay gathering dust in the corner. Lately, inspiration was a currency she couldn't afford. Her days had become a monotonous loop. Wake up, stare at a screen for 8 hours designing corporate logos that all look the same, eat a solitary dinner of takeout Thai food, and then, mercifully, escape into sleep. Sleep was her sanctuary. It was her only escape from the relentless gray of her waking life. Because in her dreams, she wasn't alone. In her dreams, there was him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was from or what he did when he wasn't a figment of her subconscious. All she knew was the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, and the startling green of his eyes, the color of moss after a fresh rain. He was a paradox, both a complete stranger and the most familiar soul she had ever known. Their dreams were never fantastical. There were no flying dragons or talking animals. They were mundane, almost painfully so, yet they were the most beautiful experiences of her life. They would walk through Pike Place Market, the air thick with the smell of fish and flowers. He'd buy her a bouquet of ridiculously overpriced tulips, and his smile would make the expense feel like the greatest bargain in the world. They'd sit in a quiet corner of a crowded coffee shop, the steam from their mugs fogging up the window pane, and talk for hours about everything and nothing. He listened, truly listened, in a way no one in her waking life ever seemed to do. He'd ask about her paintings, about the stories behind the colors she chose, and in the dream, she could explain it all perfectly, the words flowing like the very paint from her brush. Tonight was no different. The hiss of the rain against her window faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against a wooden dock. She was sitting on a bench, looking out over the calm expanse of Lake Union as the city lights began to glitter across the water. A cool breeze stirred, and she felt the familiar warmth of an arm draping over her shoulder. Cold, his voice was a low, comforting rumble, a sound that settled deep in her bones. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a perfect fit. A little. But it's okay. In the dream, it was always okay. The anxieties that plagued her waking hours, the looming deadlines, the unpaid bills, the gnawing loneliness, they all dissolved in his presence. Here, she was calm. She was seen. "I was thinking about what you said," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the distant Space Needle, a silver spear piercing the darkening sky. "About the color blue. How it's not just sadness for you. It's hope too." Evie smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "It's the color of the deep ocean, full of mystery and possibility. And it's the color of the sky on a perfect summer day, the kind you wish would never end." He turned his head, and his green eyes found hers. The intensity in his gaze always made her breath catch. It was a look of profound understanding, of a connection that felt ancient and unbreakable. "I see it now," he said softly. The dream felt longer tonight, more detailed. She could feel the rough texture of the wooden bench beneath her fingertips, smell the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent mixed with something uniquely him, something like cedar and clean air. It was these tiny, insignificant details that made it all feel so real, so tangible. And that was the problem. When her alarm clock blared at 6:30 a.m., ripping her from the dream world, the sense of loss was a physical blow. She lay in her bed, the gray Seattle morning filtering through her blinds, and the ache in her chest was overwhelming. The warmth of his arm around her shoulder was gone, replaced by the cold, empty space in her bed. The memory of his voice was already fading, like a photograph left out in the sun. She dragged herself into the kitchen and started the coffee maker, leaning her forehead against the cool cabinet door. This was getting ridiculous. It had been going on for 6 months now. 6 months of living a double life. One, a bland, colorless existence, and the other, a vibrant, secret world she shared with a man who didn't exist. Her best friend, Ben, would say she was lonely. He'd suggest she get out more, try a dating app, join a pottery class, anything to fill the void. He meant well, but he didn't understand. How could she explain that every man she met in the real world felt like a pale imitation, a black and white photo compared to the vivid, high-definition color of the man in her dreams? As she sipped her coffee, staring out at the rain-slicked street, she clutched the warm mug like a lifeline. The dream was so clear this morning. Lake Union. The bench. The way he looked at her when she talked about the color blue. A thought, sudden and sharp, pierced through her morning fog. Was it just a dream? Or was it a memory? She shook her head, dismissing the idea as absurd. She hadn't been to that part of Lake Union in years. She had never met a man with eyes that green. It was just her subconscious, her creative mind, cobbling together a perfect man from bits and pieces of movies she'd seen and books she'd read. It had to be. But as she got ready for work, a sliver of doubt remained. The feeling of his presence lingered, a phantom limb she could almost swear was still there. She found herself humming a tune, a simple, haunting melody. She didn't know the song, had no idea where she'd heard it. Then, with a jolt that nearly made her drop her toothbrush, she realized. It was the melody he was always humming in their coffee shop dreams. A melody that, until this moment, had never crossed the threshold from her sleeping mind into the waking world. The cold dread that washed over her was more chilling than the rain outside. The lines were blurring, and she was terrified to find out what would happen when they disappeared completely. The melody haunted her for the rest of the day. It was a phantom orchestra playing on a loop in the back of her mind, a simple six-note phrase that was both melancholic and strangely hopeful. During a particularly mind-numbing conference call about rebranding a line of organic dog food, she found herself mindlessly sketching the notes onto her notepad. She tried to place it. Was it from a film score? An obscure indie band Ben had made her listen to? She pulled out her phone and hummed the tune into a music recognition app. No results found. The screen announced bluntly. She tried again, then a third time. Nothing. It was a ghost, a song with no name and no artist. A song that seemingly only existed in her head and his. That night, she fell asleep with a sense of nervous anticipation. It was a feeling she'd come to recognize, like waiting for a curtain to rise on a play where she knew one of the actors intimately but had no idea what the script would be. The dream didn't disappoint. This time, they were in a bookstore. It was old, the kind of place that smelled of aging paper and leather bindings. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light cutting through tall, narrow windows. He wasn't looking at the new bestsellers. Instead, he was in a far-flung corner, running his fingers over the cracked spines of forgotten classics. He pulled out a slim, worn volume of poetry. "Have you ever read this?" he asked, holding it out to her. The cover was a faded navy blue, the title barely legible in what was once gold leaf. Evie shook her head, her eyes fixed on his hands. They were strong, with long fingers and clean, short nails. Artist's hands, maybe. "I don't think so. Who is it by?" "Doesn't matter," he said with a soft smile. "The words are what count." He opened it to a random page and read aloud. His voice wrapped around the verses, giving them a weight and meaning she was sure the author had intended. It wasn't just a reading, it was an offering. When he finished, the silence in the bookstore felt sacred. "That was beautiful," she breathed. "Just like you," he said, his green eyes locking onto hers. The Dreamworld bookstore, with its comforting scent and quiet reverence, suddenly felt charged with an electric current. He leaned in, and the space between them vanished. The kiss was gentle at first, a question, and then it deepened into something more, something that spoke of longing and a profound, inexplicable recognition. It felt more real than any kiss she'd had in her waking life. When she woke, the ghost of his lips was still on hers. The feeling was so vivid it made her blush in the solitude of her own bedroom. She lay there for a long time, letting the details of the dream solidify before the gray morning could wash them away. The bookstore, the worn poetry book, the kiss, and something else. Before the bookstore, they had been at that same coffee shop from her other dreams. He had ordered for them 2 mugs of the black wood roast, he'd said to the barista. Black, like a moonless night. Black wood roast. The name echoed in her mind as she showered and dressed. It sounded authentic, like a real brand. She grabbed her laptop and, with trembling fingers, typed it into the search bar. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She expected to find nothing, just like with the melody. But this time, she was wrong. There it was. A small, independent roaster based out of the Cascade Mountains, just east of Seattle. Their website was minimalist and rustic. They had one signature blend, Blackwood Roast. It was described as a dark, smoky blend with notes of cedar and dark chocolate. A niche brand, sold only in a handful of specialty grocers and cafes in the city. Her breath hitched. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Maybe she'd seen an ad for it somewhere, a forgotten glimpse on social media that her brain had repurposed for her dreams. That was the logical explanation. That was the sane explanation. Logic, however, did little to quiet the frantic thrumming in her veins. On her lunch break, Evie found herself walking, almost on autopilot, to a small market listed as a stockist on the Blackwood website. It was a place she'd never been to before, tucked away on a side street she rarely used. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the rich, earthy smell of coffee beans hit her immediately. And there, on a wooden shelf between bags of quinoa and jars of organic honey, was a simple brown paper bag with a stark, black logo of a pine tree. Below it, in elegant script, were the words, Blackwood Roast. Seeing it, holding the actual bag in her hands, was a fundamentally different experience than seeing it on a screen. The coarse paper was real. The beans inside shifted with a satisfying weight. This was a tangible link, a physical bridge between her world and his. Her carefully constructed wall of logic began to crumble. That evening, she called Ben. He picked up on the second ring. Evie, to what do I owe the honor? Did your ficus finally die? I told you not to overwater it. It's not the ficus, Ben, she said, her voice tighter than she intended. I need to ask you something, and I need you to just listen without telling me I'm crazy. A pause. Okay, he said, his tone shifting from jovial to concerned. I'm listening. What's up? She took a deep breath and told him everything. About the recurring dreams, the man with the green eyes, the melody she couldn't identify, and now, the coffee. She expected him to laugh, or to immediately launch into a psychological diagnosis. But he was quiet for a long moment after she finished. So, he said finally, his voice measured. You're telling me that you dreamed about a specific, real brand of coffee that you'd never heard of before, and then you found it? Yes. That's what I'm telling you. Evie, your job is literally to look at brands and logos all day. Your brain is a sponge for that stuff. You probably saw it on the side of a delivery truck, or in the background of a magazine ad 6 months ago, and filed it away. Your subconscious is just being creative. But the melody, Ben, and the way it all feels so real. Our brains do weird stuff when we're lonely, he said gently. Maybe this is just your mind's way of creating a companion. A really detailed one. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but you're starting to scare yourself. Maybe you should take that pottery class I told you about. Meet a real guy. She felt a flash of irritation. He feels real. I know you think he does, Ben sighed. Look, just be careful, okay? Don't let your imagination run away with you. It's a dream. When you wake up, it's over. That's the most important thing to remember. She hung up the phone feeling more alone than ever. Ben was right, of course. His explanation was the only one that made sense. And yet, it didn't feel right. It felt like a dismissal of something profound. She went to her kitchen, opened the bag of Blackwood Roast, and inhaled deeply. The dark, smoky aroma filled her lungs. It smelled of cedar and something else, something familiar and comforting. It smelled, she realized with a shudder, exactly like him. Ben had said to remember that when she woke up, the dream was over. But he was wrong. It was just beginning. The next morning, Evie brewed a cup of the Blackwood Roast. The ritual felt sacred, almost illicit. As the dark, aromatic steam filled her small kitchen, she closed her eyes and was transported. The scent was an anchor, pulling her back to the quiet bookstore and the comforting weight of his presence. Ben's words about her subconscious being creative seemed flimsy now, a paper-thin explanation for something that felt elemental and profound. Her mind hadn't just invented a coffee brand, it had replicated an entire sensory experience. And if the coffee was real, what about the rest of it? What about the poetry book? The thought took root and began to grow with an unstoppable, vine-like tenacity. The book was her next link. It had to be. After work, she bypassed her usual route home and instead headed towards Pioneer Square, the city's oldest neighborhood, known for its Romanesque revival architecture and, more importantly, its dense collection of used bookstores. The rain had softened to a fine mist, casting a halo around the streetlights and slicking the cobblestone streets until they shone like polished obsidian. It was the perfect atmosphere for a treasure hunt. The first store she entered was a labyrinth of towering shelves that seemed to sag under the weight of centuries of stories. The air was thick with that intoxicating smell of old paper she now associated with him. She ran her hands along the spines, her quest feeling both foolish and absolutely vital. How do you find a book when you know neither the title nor the author? All she had was a memory of a faded navy blue cover and a feeling. For 2 hours, she searched, pulling out any book that matched the description, her heart leaping with a small thrill each time, only to fall again when she saw it wasn't the one. She left empty-handed, the old book smell clinging to her clothes like a ghost. The next few days followed the same pattern. Lunch breaks were spent in tiny, hole-in-the-wall bookshops. Evenings were dedicated to methodically combing through the sprawling shelves of larger establishments. Her obsession was beginning to have consequences. She was distracted at work, turning in a logo design for a tech startup that her boss gently described as lacking focus. Ben called twice, his voice laced with a worried edge she chose to ignore. She let both calls go to voicemail. How could she explain that she was hunting for a clue from a dream? He would only try to reason with her, to pull her back to a reality that felt increasingly less real, less important, than the one she visited every night. Because every night, she was with him. The dreams became her fuel. They walked through a gallery filled with art that mirrored her own chaotic style, and he understood her paintings without her having to say a word. They sat on a rooftop, their legs dangling high above the glittering city, and he told her he felt like he'd been waiting for her his entire life. He never questioned her, never judged her. He simply accepted her. But he never told her his name, and she never asked. It felt like asking a painter the scientific formula for the color red, a technicality that would break the spell. One night, they were back in the bookstore. The navy blue volume was in his hands again. Evie's dream self felt a surge of her waking desperation. She had to know. "I wish I could remember the name of that book," she said, trying to sound casual. He looked up from the page, his green eyes seeming to see right through her, to the frantic, searching woman in the waking world. A sad, knowing smile touched his lips. The best ones don't need a name. They just need to be found. He tilted the book towards her, as if to let her read a passage. For a fleeting second, under the dim lamplight of the dream, she saw it. The author's name, embossed on the cover. The letters were worn, but the last name was unmistakable. Ainsworth. The name jolted her awake. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. Ainsworth. It was a real name, a solid piece of information she could use. She scrambled for the notepad she now kept by her bed, her hand shaking as she wrote it down before the memory could evaporate with the morning light. The next day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just aimlessly searching anymore, she had a name. After work, she returned to the first bookstore she had visited, the labyrinthine one in Pioneer Square. An elderly man with a wild halo of white hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose sat behind the counter. "Excuse me," Evie began, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm looking for a book of poetry. I don't know the title, but the author's last name is Ainsworth." The man looked at her over the top of his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Ainsworth. Haven't had a call for him in years. Most of his work is out of print. Are we talking about Charles Ainsworth?" Evie's heart skipped a beat. I think so." The cover was dark blue. The old man gave a slow nod, as if a dusty filing cabinet in his mind had just creaked open. "Ah yes. Echoes in the Static. His last collection. A bit bleak for most tastes, but powerful stuff. Let's see." He heaved himself off his stool and led her towards the back of the store, to a section she had somehow missed, labeled Local and Obscure. He ran a gnarled finger along a row of books, then stopped. "There you are, you old ghost." He pulled out a slim volume. The cover was a faded, dusty navy blue. Evie felt the air leave her lungs. It was the book. It was real. Her hands trembled as she took it from him. It felt warm, humming with a strange energy. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice choked with emotion. She paid the man in a daze and stumbled out of the store, clutching the book to her chest as if it were a living thing. She didn't wait until she got home. She ducked under the awning of a closed shop, away from the light mist of rain, and opened the cover. The first page was a title page, Echoes in the Static, by Charles Ainsworth. The second page was blank, save for a small, handwritten inscription in the top right corner. The ink was faded, a faint blue-gray against the yellowed paper, but the elegant, looping script was clear. It wasn't a long dedication, just a few simple words that made the world stand still. It said, "For Amelia. May you always hear the music. J. J." The single, elegant letter seemed to burn on the page, a brand mark on a history she was never meant to find. Evie stood frozen under the awning, the sounds of the city, the distant wail of a ferry, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, fading into a dull roar. Amelia. J. These weren't characters from a dream anymore. They were ghosts. And she was holding a piece of their story in her hands. A story that, for some inexplicable reason, had chosen to bleed into hers. She walked home in a trance, the book tucked securely inside her jacket. Her small apartment, usually a refuge, felt different tonight. It felt like a research station, a headquarters for an investigation into the impossible. She laid the book on her coffee table with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred text. She brewed another cup of the blackwood roast. The now familiar scent a comforting, grounding presence in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. Who was Charles Ainsworth? The logical first step. Her laptop glowed in the dim light of the room, casting long shadows on the walls. A quick search revealed that he was a minor figure in the Seattle literary scene, a poet's poet who had published 2 collections in the late 1980s before his untimely death in a car accident in 1992. He had been a professor at the University of Washington. He had been a recluse. There were no pictures of him online, only grainy author photos on the back of his books, showing a man with a serious expression and a thick beard. He was a dead end. He was the vessel, but not the source. The real mystery lay with Amelia and Jay. The next day, Evie called in sick to work, a small act of rebellion that felt monumental. She couldn't face designing logos today. She couldn't pretend to care about kerning and color palettes when her reality was cracking at the seams. Instead, she took a bus downtown to the Seattle Central Library, a magnificent, imposing structure of glass and steel. She felt like a detective from an old film noir, searching for a ghost in a city that had forgotten him. In the archives, surrounded by the hushed whispers and the soft rustle of turning pages, she searched for any mention of Charles Ainsworth beyond his official biography. She scrolled through microfilms of old newspapers, looking for reviews of his poetry or articles about his life. She found a few scant pieces, mostly praising his haunting, atmospheric prose. But there was no mention of his personal life, no friends, no family, and certainly no Amelia. After 3 hours, her eyes ached from the strain, and she was no closer to an answer. Frustration began to set in. The trail was cold, a 30-year-old mystery with no leads. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, the dream was different. The soft, romantic filter was gone. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with a sense of urgency. She was standing with him, but not in a cozy bookstore or a scenic park. They were in front of a grand old building with an ornate facade and a towering vertical sign. Though the sign's lights were dark, she could make out the letters, ORPHEUM. He wasn't looking at her, but at the theater's boarded-up doors. The joyful ease he normally carried was replaced by a profound sadness. His shoulders were slumped, and his jaw was tight. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice quiet. "A place for music," he said, his voice raspy. "A place where things once made sense." He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something other than affection in his green eyes. She saw pain. They couldn't hear the music, Evie. They just heard noise. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. His touch was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth she was used to. "You have to listen, please." The world began to dissolve, the edges of the dream fraying like old film. "Listen for the echo." His voice faded as she woke up, the name of the theater still ringing in her ears. The Orpheum. Her phone rang, shattering the morning silence. It was Ben. She'd been ignoring his texts for 2 days. "This time," she answered. "Evie, thank God. I was about to file a missing persons report. Are you okay? You sound awful." "I'm fine, Ben. Just working through some stuff." "Is this about the dream guy?" he asked, his voice softening. "Look, I know I was a little dismissive before, but I'm worried about you." A wave of guilt washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce need to be understood, to have someone else validate that she wasn't losing her mind. "Can you come over? There's something I need to show you." An hour later, Ben was sitting on her sofa, turning the slim volume of poetry over in his hands. She had explained everything, the search, the author, and finally, the inscription. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay," he said, setting the book down gently. "I'll admit, this is weird. Finding the exact book is a 1 in a million coincidence." "It's not a coincidence," she insisted. "Evie, people dedicate books to each other all the time. Jay could be John or James or Jerry, and Amelia could be his mother or sister. You're trying to build a bridge between this book and your dream, but you're using toothpicks and glue. It's not real." "He told me about a place last night, Ben. The Orpheum Theater." Ben pulled out his phone and typed in the name. His expression shifted. Well, there was an Orpheum Theater in Seattle, a big, famous vaudeville house downtown. He scrolled down the screen, and his face fell. Keyword being was. It burned down. In 1991. Evie stared at him, the date sending a chill down her spine. 1991, the year before the poet, Charles Ainsworth, died. The pieces were all wrong, from different puzzles, yet they felt like they should fit. Ben looked up from his phone, his face pale. Evie, this is getting scary. You're dreaming about dead poets and burned down buildings. This isn't romantic, it's morbid. Maybe you should talk to someone. A professional. His words, meant to be helpful, felt like a betrayal. He was putting her in a box, labeling her as unstable. She stood up, a cold resolve hardening within her. Thank you for your concern, Ben. But I think you should go. After he left, the silence in the apartment was absolute. He didn't get it. He saw randomness, but she saw a pattern, a message being sent in fragments across time and consciousness. A burned-down theater. A dead poet. A man in a dream who was pleading with her to listen for an echo. He was showing her places from the past, places tied to a story that ended in tragedy. And she was beginning to realize she wasn't just being shown a memory. She was being asked to solve a murder. The conversation with Ben left a bitter taste in Evie's mouth, but it solidified her resolve. He saw a fragile woman chasing ghosts. She saw a puzzle that only she could solve. He wanted her to return to the safe, gray world of logic, but she had already crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The man in her dreams, Jay, wasn't a romantic fantasy anymore. He was a victim. He was a voice crying out from a void, and for reasons she couldn't comprehend, she was the only one who could hear him. Her investigation now had a grim focal point, the Orpheum Theater fire of 1991. Armed with a thermos of blackwood roast and a fierce, almost feverish determination, she returned to the library. This time, she wasn't just looking for literary reviews, she was digging into a tragedy. The librarian, a helpful woman named Linda, showed her how to access the digital archives of the city's major newspapers. She typed in the keywords, Orpheum Fire 1991. The results flooded her screen. Dozens of articles, grainy black and white photos of firefighters battling a towering inferno, of the building's skeletal remains the morning after. The official story was straightforward. The fire, which started late on a Tuesday night in October, was ruled an accident caused by aging, faulty wiring in the backstage area. The theater had been closed at the time, so casualties were minimal. Minimal, but not zero. 2 firefighters had sustained minor injuries. And, according to a follow-up article published a week later, the remains of 1 person had been found in the deepest part of the rubble. Evie's blood ran cold as she read the clipped, dispassionate prose. The body was badly burned, beyond visual recognition. There was no identification found. The victim was a male, estimated to be in his early 20s. He was officially listed as a transient who had likely been sheltering in the abandoned building. A John Doe. A footnote in the story of a landmark's demise. A John Doe. Jay. Could it be that simple? A young man, barely more than a boy, who died alone in a fire, his name and story erased from the world. It felt right. It felt devastatingly right. He wasn't a ghost haunting her. He was a memory, trapped in the ether, trying to reclaim his own name. That night, the dream was not a dream. It was a nightmare. There was no comforting presence, no gentle conversation. There was only heat and smoke and the terrifying, splintering crack of burning timber. She was seeing through his eyes. Panic seized her as he, ran through a dark hallway, the air thick with acrid smoke that clawed at the lungs. The roar of the fire was deafening, a hungry beast consuming everything around them. Flashes of imagery assaulted her, the intricate floral pattern of the crimson carpet, a glimmer of gold from a chain around his neck, the sound of a woman screaming his name, a name that was swallowed by the roar before Evie could hear it. Then, one image burned through the chaos with crystal clarity. A poster on a wall, miraculously untouched by the flames for a brief moment. It was for a musical act, a jazz singer. A beautiful, stylized drawing of a woman with dark, wavy hair, holding a microphone. Below the image, the text read, "An Evening with Amelia Vance." Evie woke up with a gasp, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke still lingering in her nostrils. Her heart was hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape. It was the most terrifying experience of her life, and yet, it was also a gift. He had given her the final piece of the puzzle. Amelia Vance. The Amelia from the book. She waited until the library opened, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee mug. She didn't bother with the fire archives this time. She went straight to the arts and culture section, searching for information on the Seattle music scene of the late 80s and early 90s. It didn't take long to find her. Amelia Vance was a rising star in the local jazz community. There were reviews praising her soulful, captivating voice. There were photos of her performing, a charismatic presence on stage. She had been the house singer at the Orpheum for 2 years, her residency a popular draw for the city's music lovers. The article spoke of her immense talent and her tragic, abrupt departure from the music scene. In late 1991, right after the fire that destroyed her artistic home, she had canceled all her upcoming shows, packed her bags, and disappeared from Seattle altogether. There was speculation of a breakdown, of heartbreak over the loss of the theater. She had never performed publicly again. Evie printed out one of the articles, a profile on Amelia written just months before the fire. It included a photo. In it, Amelia was laughing, her head tilted back, her dark, wavy hair cascading over her shoulders. She was the woman from the poster. Beside her, with his arm draped casually around her, was a handsome young man. He wasn't smiling at the camera, he was looking at Amelia, his expression one of pure, unadulterated adoration. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead and startlingly intense eyes. Evie's breath caught in her throat. She would know those eyes anywhere. They were the color of moss after a fresh rain. It was him. She scanned the caption below the photo, her vision blurring with tears. Jazz sensation Amelia Vance with her partner and songwriter, Julian Croft, celebrating the extension of her residency at the Orpheum. Julian Croft. J.C. She whispered the name aloud, the syllables feeling both foreign and deeply familiar on her tongue. It was his name. He finally had a name. He wasn't John Doe. He was Julian Croft. He was a songwriter, a man who loved a singer. May you always hear the music. It was all real. He hadn't been a transient sheltering from the cold. He had been in that theater with the woman he loved, the night it burned to the ground. And Evie knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the fire had been no accident. Julian Croft. His name was a prayer on her lips, a secret she whispered into the quiet of her apartment. Seeing his face in that old photograph had changed everything. The vague, dreamlike image in her mind had sharpened into focus, replaced by the real, smiling face of a young man full of life and love. He was no longer a beautiful enigma, he was a person. A songwriter who loved a jazz singer, who dedicated poetry to her, who died in a fire and was erased from the world. The injustice of it burned in her gut, a cold, hard knot of anger that overshadowed her fear. Her quest was no longer about understanding her own mind, it was about reclaiming his memory. The first most glaring question was the one that kept her awake all night. If Julian Croft, a known partner to the theater's star performer, died in the fire, why was he buried as a John Doe? Why hadn't Amelia identified him? She was there. The dream had been a maelstrom of smoke and heat, but she had heard a woman scream a name. It must have been his. Why would she let the world believe he was a nameless transient? Evie spent the entire next day digging into Julian's life, but the digital footprint of a young, not yet famous songwriter from the early 90s was practically non-existent. There was no social media, no trail of blog posts. She found a few mentions of him in archived reviews of Amelia's performances, often crediting him as the lyricist for her more popular songs. One critic called his writing hauntingly beautiful, with a wisdom that belies his age. He was a ghost in the machine, a footnote in someone else's story. There was no record of his family, no mention of where he came from. It was as if he had only existed in the orbit of Amelia Vance, which meant the only path to Julian was through Amelia. She was the keeper of the story, the only living witness. But she had vanished. Evie began a new, more desperate search. She searched for Amelia Vance on every platform she could think of. Public records, social media, people finder websites that promised everything and delivered nothing. The trail went cold in 1991. It was like she had stepped off the face of the earth. Defeated, she slumped back on her couch, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating her exhausted face. She felt Julian's absence that night like a physical ache. She needed a new clue, another piece of the map. She closed her eyes, focusing on his face from the photograph, and willed herself to sleep, to go to him. The dream, when it came, was soft and quiet, a respite from the nightmare of the fire. She was in a small, dimly lit room with a piano in the corner. Julian was there, sitting not at the piano, but on a stool beside it, a guitar resting in his lap. Amelia was at the keys, her fingers dancing over them, playing a simple, melancholic chord progression. "No, that's not quite it," she said, her voice a low, musical hum. "The transition is too harsh. It needs to feel like the moment the rain stops, but the sky is still gray." Julian smiled, that same adoring look from the photograph on his face. He gently plucked a sequence of notes on his guitar. "What about this?" The sound was perfect, a bridge of notes that seamlessly connected the two chords. Amelia's face lit up. She played it on the piano. "Yes, that's it. That's beautiful, Jules. It's our song," he said softly. "It should be." He began to hum a melody over the chords, and then he sang, his voice not as polished as Amelia's, but full of a raw, honest emotion. The words were a half-formed sketch, but a few phrases emerged with perfect clarity. Smell of cedar and rain, a ghost in the static, find my way home again. Cedar and rain. The scent she had first associated with him. Echoes in the static. The name of the poetry book. It was all connected. Evie woke with the melody in her head and a new search term in her mind. She sat at her laptop, the early morning light filtering through her blinds, and typed in a new combination, Amelia Vance, and Cedar and Rain. For a moment, nothing. Just the same dead ends. But then, she scrolled down, past the official search results, to a link for an old, defunct online music forum. The post was from 15 years ago. The title was, Whatever Happened to Amelia Vance? Her heart hammered in her chest. She clicked the link. A user named Seattle Jazzcat had written, I've been listening to an old bootleg of Amelia Vance from the Orpheum. She was incredible. Does anyone know what happened to her? She performed this one amazing original song. I think it was called Cedar and Rain, and it was a masterpiece. Then she just disappeared. Evie scrolled down the thread of replies. Most were just other fans mourning her disappearance. But then, there was one. A short, simple reply from a user named MusicMan99, posted 3 years after the original question. Heard from a guy who knew her back in the day that she left the city after the fire. Moved somewhere quiet to get her head straight. A little coastal town in Oregon, I think. Astoria, maybe. Astoria, Oregon. A real place. A solid lead. It wasn't proof, but it was a breadcrumb, a tiny glimmer of light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. Ben would call it a long shot, a wild goose chase based on a 15-year-old internet comment. But Evie knew better. This wasn't a random guess. This was Julian, guiding her, pointing her toward the one person left who knew the truth. She looked around her small apartment, at the half-finished canvases and the life she had put on hold. Seattle was her home, but the answers she needed weren't here. They were in a quiet coastal town a few hours' drive away. They were with a woman who had run away from a fire 30 years ago. A woman who had a story to tell. Evie stood up and grabbed her car keys. The time for research was over. It was time to go find Amelia. There was no hesitation. The moment the plan formed in her mind, it became an undeniable truth. She had to go to Astoria. She threw a few days' worth of clothes into an overnight bag, grabbed her laptop, the poetry book, and the printout of Julian and Amelia's photograph. She left a pot of coffee half full on the counter and a pile of mail unopened on her table. As she locked the door to her apartment, she felt she was locking away her old life, a life of quiet observation. She was stepping into the painting now, becoming an active participant in the story. The drive south from Seattle was a surreal transition. The familiar skyline of her city shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless green expanse of Washington's forests. The hiss of the Seattle rain gave way to the rhythmic thrum of her tires on the highway. With every mile that passed, the entire quest felt more and more insane. She was acting on clues delivered by a ghost in her dreams. She was chasing a woman who had been a phantom for 3 decades, all based on a single, anonymous comment on a forgotten internet forum. Ben's worried voice echoed in her head, telling her she was having a breakdown, that she was chasing shadows. For a moment, gripping the steering wheel, she wondered if he was right. But then, she would glance at the photograph of Julian on the passenger seat, at the way he looked at Amelia, and a fierce certainty would wash away the doubt. This was real. He was real. She could feel his urgency, a silent passenger in the car with her, propelling her forward. She crossed the stunning 4-mile-long Astoria Megler Bridge as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the water. The town of Astoria, Oregon, revealed itself, a cluster of weathered, historic buildings clinging to a steep, green hill overlooking the mouth of the Columbia River. The air that drifted through her open window was cool and smelled of salt and damp wood. It was a town that felt saturated with history, a place of fog and secrets, the perfect final resting place for a story like this. After checking into a nondescript motel with a flickering neon sign, the reality of her task crashed down on her. She had a town, but no address, no new name, nothing. Where did one even begin to look for a ghost? Her first 24 hours were a lesson in futility. She looked up A. Vance in a tattered phone book she found in her room, a hopeless gesture that yielded nothing. She spent hours at the local library, searching public records for anyone who might have moved to the area in late 1991 or early 1992, an impossibly broad search that left her with a headache and a list of 200 random names. She walked the town's charming but hilly streets, looking at the faces of every woman who seemed to be the right age, her heart leaping with false hope at every glimpse of dark, wavy hair. By the end of the second day, a cold despair began to seep in. She was on a fool's errand. Julian had led her here, but the trail had finally gone cold. That night, exhausted and defeated, she collapsed into the lumpy motel bed. She clutched the poetry book to her chest, a final, desperate plea to the man in her dreams. "Don't give up on me, Julian," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm lost. Show me the way." Sleep wrapped around her like a thick fog, and in it, he appeared. They weren't in a memory this time. They were in Astoria. She recognized the steep, sloping streets outside a window. But they were inside a small, cluttered shop. It was filled with musical instruments, vintage guitars hanging on the walls, a cello case leaning in a corner, dusty amplifiers stacked on the floor. The air smelled of lemon oil and old wood. Julian wasn't speaking. He simply stood in the center of the room and looked at a glass display counter. Inside, on a velvet stand, was a single, silver locket. He looked at the locket, then he turned his intense, green eyes to her. It wasn't a plea or a warning. It was an instruction. A signpost. She woke before dawn, the image of the music shop burned into her mind. She could remember every detail, the faded green paint on the walls, the crack in the window, the hand-painted sign hanging outside, which read, "Riverfront Strings." It was a real place. She knew it in her bones. She wasn't lost anymore. He had given her the next step. She showered and dressed in a rush of adrenaline. A quick search on her phone confirmed it. Riverfront Strings was a real music shop on a commercial street down by the old cannery buildings. It had been in business for over 40 years. Walking towards the shop that morning, with a cool mist drifting in from the river, Evie felt a sense of terrifying purpose. This was it. This was the first door she would knock on, the first real-world connection to the mystery. She was done with archives and internet forums. From this moment on, her investigation would involve real people. As she reached the address, she looked up. The sign was exactly as she'd seen it in the dream, a bit more weathered, perhaps, but unmistakable. She stood outside for a long moment, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a deep, steadying breath, the salty air filling her lungs. Then, with a hand that barely trembled, she reached for the door. A small bell chimed as she pushed it open, announcing her arrival to the ghosts of the past. The chime of the bell faded, leaving a thick, reverent silence in its wake. The music shop was exactly as she had seen it in her dream, a dusty sanctuary of forgotten melodies. Light struggled to filter through the grimy front window, illuminating a collection of violins and mandolins hanging on the wall like sleeping bats. The air was heavy with the scent of rosin, old wood, and lemon oil. Behind a glass counter, an elderly man with a kind, wrinkled face and a cascade of white hair was carefully restringing a guitar. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes peering at her over a pair of half-moon glasses. "Can I help you?" His voice was a low, gentle rumble, like a softly plucked bass string. Evie's carefully rehearsed plan evaporated. Her throat felt tight. "I'm just looking," she managed to say, her voice sounding small and foreign in the quiet room. She moved deeper into the shop, running her hand over the cool, smooth body of a cello. She was here. This was real. She needed a plausible opening. "You have a beautiful collection," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. "I'm interested in the Seattle music scene, from back in the 90s. I was wondering if you ever got any instruments from musicians up that way." The man set the guitar down and polished his hands on a rag. "Occasionally. Mostly folks moving down the coast looking to sell off old gear. Can't say I remember many specific names. That was a long time ago." His gaze was patient, but questioning. Evie's eyes drifted to the glass counter, her heart quickening. There it was. Tucked between a tray of guitar picks and some tarnished tuning forks was a silver locket, resting on a small, faded velvet stand. It was oval-shaped, with a delicate etching of a bird on the front. It was exactly as Julian had shown her. "That's a beautiful locket," she said, pointing. "Is it for sale?" The man's expression softened into something melancholic. "Ah, that. No, afraid not. It's a sad little story, that one." He leaned on the counter, his gaze distant. "A woman left it with me for repair. Oh, must be 15 years ago now. The clasp was broken. I fixed it the same day, but she never came back for it. I've kept it here ever since, hoping she might walk through that door again one day." This was it. The connection. What was she like? Evie asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Quiet," the man said, thoughtfully. "Very quiet. Had a sadness about her I could never quite put my finger on. Like she was haunted by something. She used to live a few miles out of town, would only come in for guitar strings once or twice a year. Always paid in cash. I believe she called herself Anna. Anna. A new name. A shield. Evie took a deep breath. It was a gamble, a huge leap of faith, but she had to take it. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folded, creased printout of the photograph. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it and placed it on the counter, sliding it towards him. It showed the laughing face of Amelia Vance and the adoring gaze of Julian Croft. "Was this her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Was this Anna?" The old man, whose name she now saw on a small, engraved plaque was Arthur, picked up the photograph. He held it closer to the light, his eyes widening in recognition. The professional calm he maintained fell away, replaced by genuine shock. "My word," he breathed, looking from the photo to Evie and back again. "Yes. A younger version, certainly, but that's her. That's the same woman. I haven't seen her smile like that in all the years I've known her." He looked at Julian's face, a flicker of a memory in his eyes. "And him. I feel like I've seen him before, a long time ago. Can't quite place it." "His name was Julian Croft," Evie said, the name feeling solid and real as she spoke it to a stranger. "He was a songwriter." Arthur gently placed the photograph back on the counter. "What is all this about, young lady? Who are you?" "I'm a friend of the family," Evie lied, the words feeling clumsy. "I'm trying to find her. It's important." Julian's story was never finished, and I think she's the only one who knows the ending. Arthur looked at her for a long, searching moment. He seemed to see past her flimsy excuse, to the raw, desperate truth in her eyes. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "She's a recluse, you know. Has been for as long as I can remember. Lives in an old farmhouse up on Ridge Road, overlooking the bay. Doesn't get visitors. Doesn't want them." He paused, his gaze turning serious. "The ghosts she lives with are company enough for her, I suppose. If you go up there, you be careful. Some stories are left buried for a reason." He wrote the address on a small piece of paper. As Evie took it from him, her fingers brushed his, and she felt a strange sense of gratitude, of a torch being passed. She had the final piece of the map. An address. A real, physical place where the ghost of Amelia Vance lived under the name Anna. She thanked Arthur, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, and walked out of the shop, the bell chiming her departure. The misty Astoria air felt electric now, charged with possibility. She looked at the address scrawled in Arthur's shaky handwriting. Ridge Road. She was no longer chasing a memory or a dream. She was minutes away from meeting the woman who had loved Julian Croft, the woman who had survived the fire, the woman who had let him be buried without a name. And as she got into her car and started the engine, she knew that whatever secrets Amelia Vance had been keeping for 30 years, they were about to be brought into the light. Ridge Road was less of a road and more of a suggestion, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that wound its way up a steep hill away from the town. The trees on either side grew thick and close, their branches forming a canopy that cast the road in a perpetual twilight. Evie's small car struggled on the incline, and with each turn, she felt more isolated, more cut off from the world. Arthur's warning about ghosts echoed in her mind. She was driving directly into the heart of a haunting. The house was at the very end of the road, perched on a bluff with a staggering panoramic view of the churning gray ocean. But the house itself took no joy in its location. It was a simple, two-story farmhouse that had long ago surrendered to the relentless assault of the coastal weather. The paint was peeling in long strips, the porch sagged on one side, and the garden was an untamed riot of weeds and overgrown rose bushes. It was a house that had pulled into itself, wanting only to be left alone. It was the perfect fortress for a recluse. Evie parked her car but didn't get out immediately. She sat for a full minute, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow bursts. This was the end of the line. The spectral trail of breadcrumbs, a melody, a coffee, a book, a theater, a name, had all led to this dilapidated house on a lonely hill. She was terrified, not of the woman inside, but of the truth she was about to unearth. What if the story was darker than she ever imagined? She looked at the passenger seat, at the poetry book and the photograph. She was here for Julian. Taking a final, steadying breath, she got out of the car. The walk to the front door felt a mile long. The wooden steps of the porch groaned under her weight. There was no doorbell, just a heavy, tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a seagull. She lifted it and let it fall. The sound was loud and hollow, an intrusion that seemed to shock the silent air. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She heard nothing. She was about to knock again when the door creaked open, just a few inches. A woman peered out from the darkness within. She was older than the photo, of course, but the bone structure was the same. The face was thinner, etched with lines of worry and a deep, abiding sadness. Her dark hair was now streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun, but the most profound change was in her eyes. The vibrant, laughing eyes from the photograph were gone, replaced by a pair that were flat, guarded, and weary. This was Amelia Vance, or the ghost that remained of her. "We don't get visitors," the woman said, her voice a rusty croak from disuse. "Whatever you're selling, we're not interested." "I'm not selling anything," Evie said, her own voice surprisingly steady. "My name is Evelyn Reed." "Are you Anna?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" Evie knew her cover story was the only way in. "I'm a music historian. I'm writing a book about the Seattle jazz scene in the early 90s. I came across your name, Amelia Vance. Your work at the Orpheum was legendary. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about that time." A shuttered, hostile look came over the woman's face. "You have the wrong person. My name is Anna. I've lived in Astoria my whole life. Now if you'll excuse me." She began to push the door closed. Panic flared in Evie's chest. This was her only chance. "Please," she said, her voice rising with an urgency that surprised them both. "I just want to talk about the songs. The ones you wrote with Julian Croft." The name hit the air and hung there, a gunshot in the silence. The door stopped moving. The woman's hand froze on the edge. Her face, which had been a mask of hostile indifference, seemed to crumble. The blood drained from her cheeks, and for the first time, a flicker of raw, terrified emotion showed in her deadened eyes. She stared at Evie, truly seeing her for the first time. Who are you?" Amelia whispered, the name Anna completely forgotten. Evie knew this was the moment. She reached into her bag and slowly pulled out the navy blue poetry book. She held it up. "Echoes in the static," she said softly. Amelia flinched as if she'd been struck. Her eyes were fixed on the book, a relic from a life she had tried to bury. "He gave this to you," Evie continued, her voice gentle but firm. She opened the cover to the inscription. "He wrote, for Amelia. May you always hear the music." She then pulled out the photograph and held it beside the book. "He loved you very much." Amelia stared at the items, at the tangible proof of a past she had fled from for 30 years. The face of the smiling girl in the picture was a stranger to her now. The face of the man beside her was a wound that had never healed. Her carefully constructed walls, built over decades of isolation and grief, shattered into a million pieces. A choked, ragged sob escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her shoulders began to shake. She looked up at Evie, her eyes wild with a storm of emotions, grief, fear, and a terrifying, dawning suspicion. The question of who Evie was transformed into a much more frightening one. Her voice was a broken, trembling whisper, a sound pulled from the deepest part of her soul. "How?" she asked, her gaze searching Evie's face for an answer she couldn't possibly comprehend. "How do you know these things?" Amelia's question hung in the salt-laced air, a fragile bridge between the past and the present. For a long moment, she simply stared at Evie, her mind reeling, trying to process the impossible. The stranger on her porch held the ghost of her life in her hands. The defenses Amelia had spent 3 decades building had been leveled in an instant. With a shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all those lost years, she stepped back from the door, pulling it open. It was not an invitation so much as a surrender. "Come in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Evie stepped across the threshold and into the house. If the outside was a fortress, the inside was a tomb. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, and the air was stale and heavy with disuse. Most of the furniture was draped in ghostly white sheets. There were no photographs on the walls, no books on the shelves, no hint of the vibrant, musical life this woman had once lived. It was a space scrubbed clean of memories, a self-imposed prison of forgetting. Amelia gestured towards a sheet-covered armchair before sinking onto an adjacent sofa, her movements stiff and weary. She didn't remove the sheet. They sat in the dim, dusty silence, 2 strangers connected by a dead man. Evie knew she had to offer an explanation, something Amelia's grief-shattered mind could latch onto. The truth was not an option. "My grandmother passed away recently," Evie began, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "She was Julian's aunt. They weren't close, and our side of the family lost touch with him years before he died. When I was going through her things, I found a box of his. Some old song lyrics, notebooks, and that poetry book. I never knew him, but I felt this connection. I read his words, and I had to know what happened to him. The official story never made sense." She paused, letting the story sink in. "My research eventually led me to you." Amelia listened, her expression unreadable. Whether she believed the story or was simply too exhausted to question it, Evie couldn't tell. Amelia picked at a loose thread on the sofa, her gaze fixed on the floor. Julian, she said, the name a strange and painful marvel on her tongue. He was light. That's the only word for it. He saw beauty everywhere, even in a rain-soaked city like Seattle. He believed words could change the world. He wrote songs for me that were like prayers. He made me believe I was better than I was. A faint, sad smile touched her lips for the first time. He gave me that book a month before everything. We were in that old bookstore in Pioneer Square. He read a poem from it aloud, right there in the aisle. His voice, it could make you believe anything. Evie listened, her heart aching. This was the man from her dreams, described by the woman he loved. She was hearing about his life, his light, from the person who knew him best. It felt like a sacred gift. He was so excited about the Orpheum, Amelia continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories flowed. We both were. The owner, Marcus Thorne, had just bought the place. He was this charismatic, wealthy businessman who promised to restore it to its former glory. He loved my music, or so he said. He gave me a residency, and Jules was my official songwriter. It felt like everything we had ever worked for was finally happening. The sad smile vanished, replaced by a shadow. But Julian, he was pure, you know? He believed in honesty above all else. And he started to see things that weren't right. What kind of things? Evie asked softly, leaning forward. Marcus Thorne was charming, but he was a shark. He moved in circles that were dangerous. Julian started noticing discrepancies in the theater's finances. Invoices for renovations that never happened, payrolls padded with names of people who didn't exist. He thought Thorne was using the theater as a front to launder money. The air in the room grew colder, thicker. This was it. The reason. Julian was a writer, not a fighter, Amelia said, her voice dropping to a fearful whisper. But his conscience wouldn't let it go. He told me he was gathering proof, that he was going to expose Thorne. I begged him to stop, to just walk away. We had our music, we had each other. That's all that mattered. But he said it was bigger than us. He said letting men like Thorne win was how the world filled up with darkness. She wrapped her arms around herself, a chill running through her despite the stuffy air. The night of the fire, he told me he had found the last piece of evidence he needed. A ledger, hidden in Thorne's office at the theater. He was going to get it that night after everyone had gone home. I told him it was too dangerous. Amelia looked up, and her eyes met Evie's. The weariness was gone, replaced by a raw, 30-year-old terror that was as fresh as if it were yesterday. You don't understand, she choked out, her voice cracking. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a crook. He was ruthless. Julian was so beautifully naive. He thought he was dealing with a simple businessman. Her eyes darted towards the windows, as if she expected to see a dark figure standing outside. You shouldn't have come here, she whispered, her voice trembling violently now. You think this is a story from the past, but it's not. Men like him, their power doesn't just fade away. If he ever found out you were asking questions about Julian, about that night, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terrifying certainty. He wouldn't just dismiss you, she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. He would erase you, just like he erased Julian. Amelia's words fell into the dusty silence of the room, each one a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. He would erase you. The threat was no longer a vague, historical danger. It was immediate, personal, and terrifyingly real. The romantic, spectral nature of Evie's quest dissolved, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a 30-year-old crime with a living, breathing villain. The ghost she was chasing had a monster, and that monster was still out there. What happened that night, Amelia? Evie asked, her voice quiet but firm. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but Julian's memory was a fire in her heart, and it burned hotter. You have to tell me everything. Amelia looked away, her gaze settling on the grimy window that overlooked the turbulent ocean. It was as if she was seeing the past play out on the waves. He was supposed to be back by midnight, she began, her voice taking on a distant, haunted quality. He was just going to slip into the theater, get the ledger from Thorne's office, and leave. He had a key. He was so sure he could do it without being seen. She paused, taking a shaky breath. But midnight came and went. Then 1 o'clock. I couldn't stop pacing. I had this awful, sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I called his apartment, over and over. No answer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to the theater, praying I'd see him walking down the street, that his car had just broken down. When I got there, the street was empty, quiet. I was about to get out of my car when I saw Marcus Thorne walking out of the theater's side entrance. He wasn't strolling, he was moving fast. He looked agitated, angry. He got into his car and sped off without even turning on his headlights. A few minutes later, I smelled it. Smoke. Just a faint whiff at first. Then I saw it, a flicker of orange through a backstage window. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Evie waited, the silence filled only by the sound of Amelia's ragged breathing. I ran, Amelia continued, her voice muffled by her hands. I ran towards the building, screaming his name. I tried the door, but it was locked. The smoke was getting thicker, pouring out from under the eaves. The fire grew so fast, Evie. So fast. It was an inferno in minutes. I knew he was still in there. I knew it. And I knew Thorne had done it. He'd found Julian, and he'd set the fire to destroy the ledger and him. To destroy the only witness. She finally lowered her hands, and her face was a mask of self-loathing. The smart thing to do, the brave thing, would have been to go to the police. To tell them what I saw. But I wasn't brave. I was a terrified 25-year-old girl. I had just seen the man I loved murdered by a powerful, ruthless monster who now knew I existed. All I could think was that he would come for me next. That he would silence me too. Here was the answer. The final, painful piece of the puzzle. So you ran, Evie said softly. Amelia nodded, tears streaming freely down her face. That night, I went back to my apartment, threw whatever I could fit into a suitcase, and drove until I ran out of gas. I abandoned him. I let them call him a John Doe. I let his memory be buried under a lie because I was a coward. I came here, changed my name, and I've been hiding from that night ever since. The confession, spoken aloud for the first time in 30 years, seemed to drain the last of her energy. She sagged against the sofa, a hollowed-out shell of a woman. Evie left soon after, her mind a whirlwind of grief, anger, and fear. The story was so much worse than she had imagined. Julian hadn't just been a victim of a tragic accident. He had been a hero, murdered for trying to do the right thing. Back in the sterile anonymity of her motel room, Evie felt the full weight of her situation. She was in a strange town, alone, with knowledge that could get her killed. For the first time, she considered walking away. She could go back to Seattle, back to her gray, safe life. She had found out what happened. She had given his story back to Amelia. Maybe that was enough. Exhausted and conflicted, she fell into a fitful sleep. And he came to her. The dream was fragmented, chaotic, filled with the echoes of the fire. She saw Julian, not as a calm guide, but as he must have been in those final moments, frantic, determined, and running out of time. He was in Thorne's office. He had the ledger, but he knew he was trapped. The fire was spreading. He looked around desperately, not for an escape, but for a place to hide the truth. His eyes landed on his own briefcase. He shoved the ledger inside, locked it, and then, the vision shifted. He was no longer in the theater. He was in a bank. He was placing something into a safety deposit box. It wasn't the briefcase. It was a single, brass key. He held it up for her to see, and on it was a number, 413. He looked directly at her, his expression not of fear, but of grim purpose. "The echo," he said, his voice clear and strong amidst the dream's chaos. "Listen for the echo." Evie woke with a jolt, her heart pounding. 413, the number was seared into her brain. It all clicked into place with a terrifying, brilliant clarity. Julian knew Thorne was coming. He knew he wouldn't make it out alive. But he had a plan. He wasn't trying to save himself, he was trying to save the proof. The ledger wasn't destroyed in the fire. He had found a way to secure it. He had hidden it away, and the key to finding it was in a safety deposit box. The fear she had felt earlier was consumed by a wave of pure, cold adrenaline. Her mission wasn't over. In fact, it had just been given a new, tangible purpose. She wasn't just avenging a memory anymore. She was finishing what Julian started. She had to find that key. She had to find box 413. And she had to find the truth that Marcus Thorne had tried to burn to ashes 30 years ago. The motel room, which had felt like a dead end just hours before, was now buzzing with a new, dangerous energy. Box 413. The number was a key, a promise, a destination. Evie knew with absolute certainty that her time in Astoria was over. The story was here, but the proof was back in Seattle. The safety deposit box, the bank, Julian's life. It was all rooted in the city where he had lived and died. Before she left, there was one last thing she had to do. She drove back up the winding, misty road to the farmhouse on the bluff. This time, when Amelia opened the door, she didn't look hostile or terrified, just hollowed out and fragile. Evie didn't wait to be invited in. "He hid it," Evie said, the words rushing out. "The ledger, the proof. It wasn't destroyed in the fire. I'm certain of it. He found a way to hide it before Thorn got to him." She couldn't explain the dream, so she didn't try. She presented it as a conclusion she had drawn, a gut feeling that was too strong to ignore. "Amelia, did Julian ever mention a safety deposit box? A specific bank, anything like that?" Amelia's brow furrowed, her mind digging through a dusty archive of memories. "A safety deposit box? No, I don't think so. He wasn't the type to trust banks with anything important. He said they were just as crooked as men like Thorn." She shook her head. Anything truly valuable, his lyrics, our contracts, his father's watch, he kept it all in his briefcase. His briefcase? Evie's senses sharpened. Yes, an old, beat-up leather one he took everywhere. He called it the vault. After he was gone, I always wondered what happened to it. I assumed it was burned in the fire with him. But it wouldn't have been. He didn't take it to the theater that night. He was trying to be inconspicuous. It would have been at his apartment. An apartment that belonged to a man the world believed was a nameless John Doe. "Thank you, Amelia," Evie said, a new plan already forming in her mind. "This isn't over. I'm going to finish this." For the first time, a flicker of something other than grief appeared in Amelia's eyes. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. "Be careful," she whispered. "Please." The drive back to Seattle was the polar opposite of her journey down. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a steely, laser-focused resolve. Julian's briefcase. That was the next step. If it had been in his apartment when he died, the police would have collected it. And since no one ever claimed the belongings of John Doe, they would have eventually been moved to a city facility, a warehouse for unclaimed property. Back in her own apartment, the familiar space felt alien. The half-finished canvases seemed trivial, relics from a life she no longer lived. She was an investigator now, a woman haunted and guided by a ghost on a mission for justice. But as she sat at her laptop, she hit a wall. Accessing 30-year-old police evidence logs and municipal storage records wasn't something you could just do with a Google search. The bureaucracy was a fortress, designed to keep people like her out. She thought of hiring a private investigator, but the idea felt wrong. This was her mission. It was personal. Besides, how would she explain the case? "I need you to find a briefcase that belonged to a ghost who talks to me in my sleep." She would be laughed out of the office. The truth settled on her with a heavy certainty. She couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. The investigation had moved from the realm of dreams and archives into the world of police procedure and legal red tape. She needed help from someone in the real world. Someone who, despite everything, trusted her. Her mind immediately went to Ben. She pictured his worried face, his logical arguments, his gentle pleas for her to seek professional help. She had pushed him away, shut him out, and dismissed his concerns. The thought of calling him now, of asking for his help, filled her with a profound sense of shame. But the alternative, giving up, letting Thorn win, letting Julian's sacrifice be for nothing, was unthinkable. His memory deserved more. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over his name in her contacts list. For a moment, she hesitated. This call would change everything. It would mean pulling Ben into this dangerous story, making him a potential target. But it would also mean she wasn't alone anymore. She would have to tell him everything, not the fabricated story she told Amelia, but the whole, insane, unbelievable truth. About the dreams, about Julian, about the murder. It was the ultimate test of their friendship. She took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and electric. She thought of Julian, of his courage in the face of a monster, and found a sliver of her own. With a final, silent apology to her friend for the storm she was about to bring into his life, she pressed the call button. The phone began to ring, each pulse a countdown to the moment her secret world collided with reality. The phone rang 3 times, each electronic pulse stretching into an eternity. Evie was about to hang up, her courage failing, when the call connected. "Evie!" Ben's voice was a complicated knot of emotions, relief, frustration, and deep-seated worry. "Are you okay? I've been calling. I was about to drive to Astoria myself." "I'm okay, Ben. I'm back in Seattle," she said, her voice small. "And I am so sorry for shutting you out. But I need your help. Can we please meet? I will tell you everything." The whole story. I promise. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She could hear him weighing his frustration against his concern for her. Okay, he said finally, the sigh in his voice audible. The late-night coffee shop on Olive Way. 30 minutes. The coffee shop was an oasis of light and warmth against the dark, rain-slicked Seattle night. Ben was already there, sitting in a booth in the back corner, a half-empty mug in his hands. He looked tired. As she slid into the seat opposite him, he didn't smile, just watched her with an intense, searching gaze. You look like you've been through a war, he said bluntly. It feels like I have, she admitted. She didn't waste time with small talk. She took a deep breath and, starting from the very beginning, she told him everything. She didn't edit or soften it. She told him about the dreams, how they started, how real they felt. She told him about the man with the green eyes, the melody, the Blackwood roast coffee. She slid the worn poetry book across the table and opened it to the inscription. She laid the photograph of a smiling Julian and Amelia next to it. Then, she moved from the dreams to the facts. She told him Julian's name, about his murder at the Orpheum, and the fire that was meant to cover it up. She told him about the powerful, charismatic monster named Marcus Thorne and the money laundering scheme Julian had uncovered. She told him about her trip to Astoria, about finding a broken, terrified Amelia Vance living under a different name. She recounted Amelia's harrowing story of that night and her cowardly flight from the city. Ben listened without interruption, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion, then to shock. He picked up the photograph, his eyes studying the faces. He read the inscription in the book. He was a man who dealt in facts and logic, and she was laying out a trail of verifiable, tangible evidence that was impossible to dismiss, no matter how insane its source. And the dreams, he finally said, his voice quiet. You think his ghost is communicating with you? I don't know what I think, Ben, she answered honestly. I just know that they guide me. Every time I hit a wall, a dream shows me the next step. It's how I knew to go to Astoria. It's how I found the music shop. And last night, it's how I learned that the evidence, the ledger Julian died for, wasn't destroyed in the fire. She leaned forward, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. He hid it. But before he could tell Amelia where, he was killed. I think the key to finding it is in the briefcase he kept at his apartment. She finally finished, the entire, unbelievable story laid bare between them. The silence in the booth was deafening. Ben stared at the items on the table, then at her face, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the supernatural with the tangible. Marcus Thorne, he said, pulling out his phone. He typed the name into a search engine. The results were instantaneous. A profile of one of Seattle's most successful real estate developers and philanthropists filled the screen. There were pictures of him at charity galas, shaking hands with the mayor, his face a mask of distinguished, silver-haired charm. His corporate headquarters was the Thorne Tower, one of the tallest buildings in the city. Ben looked up from his phone, his face pale. Evie, this man isn't just some old crook. He's one of the most powerful men in the city. If what you're saying is true, you are in so much danger. I know, she whispered. That was the turning point. The fear for her safety overrode his skepticism about the dreams. He could spend all night arguing about ghosts and the subconscious, but it wouldn't change the facts. She had stumbled into a 30-year-old murder mystery, and the killer was still out there, more powerful than ever. His briefcase, Ben said, his mind shifting into a pragmatic, problem-solving mode. If he died as a John Doe, his effects would have been catalogued by the SPD and held as unclaimed property. After a certain number of years, they'd be sent to the city archives or a long-term municipal storage facility. Getting access to those records from 30 years ago, it's going to be nearly impossible for a civilian. That's why I need you, Ben, she said, her voice cracking with the strain of it all. I'm in over my head. I can't do this alone. He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at her fierce, desperate expression. He ran a hand through his hair, a long, deep sigh escaping his lips. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in his friend, and he believed she was in trouble. Okay, he said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. Okay, Evie, I'm in. We're in this together. He pushed his coffee mug aside and leaned forward, his eyes sharp and focused. I think you're in more danger than you can possibly imagine. So, we're going to be smart about this. No more running off on your own. He looked at her, a hint of his old familiar warmth returning to his eyes. So, where do we start looking for a ghost's briefcase? Ben's agreement to help transformed the very air in Evie's apartment. The lonely, haunted space became a strategic command center. Her dining table, once littered with takeout containers and art supplies, was now covered in maps of 1990 Seattle, printouts of newspaper articles, and Ben's laptop, which was perpetually open to a complex web of city government websites. A strange, focused energy crackled between them. They were a team, Evie, the heart, driven by an impossible connection to the past, and Ben, the brain, navigating the cold, hard logic of the present. Ben dove into the bureaucratic maze with a methodical determination that Evie found both impressive and deeply comforting. He spent 2 days meticulously researching the city's protocols for handling unclaimed property from unidentified persons. As he suspected, the process was a fortress of red tape. "Okay, here's the problem," he said on the third day, pushing his glasses up on his nose and pointing at a flowchart he'd sketched out on a notepad. The Seattle Police Department would have held Julian's effects, whatever they collected from his apartment, for a set period. After that, because he was a John Doe with no claimants, his property would have been transferred to the Department of Executive Administration's long-term storage. It's a massive, climate-controlled warehouse south of the city. A black hole for forgotten things. "So we just go there?" Evie asked, a hopeful edge in her voice. "Not a chance," Ben said, shaking his head. "You can't just walk in and ask for a dead guy's briefcase from 30 years ago. We need a legal claim. The best route is to pose as a relative, but to do that, we'd need to prove kinship. That means birth certificates, legal notices, stuff we don't have. And we can't create a link to a John Doe. We need a name that's in the system." They were at a standstill. They knew who Julian was, but the city that had buried him didn't. They had the story, but not the key to unlock the archives. Frustration gnawed at Evie. They were so close, yet an impenetrable wall of procedure stood in their way. That night, she fell into an exhausted sleep, the unsolvable puzzle turning over and over in her mind. The dream came, not as a memory or a nightmare, but as a quiet, simple clarification. She was standing in a stark, white room. Julian was there, looking not at her, but at his old leather briefcase, which sat on a table between them. He opened it. Inside, nestled among sheets of music and notebooks, was a wallet. He took out his driver's license. He didn't show her the photo or the address. He just held it so that one detail was in sharp, perfect focus: his full, legal name, Julian Charles Croft. The middle name, Charles, seemed to glow with an otherworldly significance. He looked up from the license and met her gaze. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. The name. The full name is the key. She woke up with the name echoing in her head. Julian Charles Croft. She immediately told Ben. His middle name was Charles, she said, the certainty in her voice leaving no room for argument. "I know it." Ben looked at her, his expression a familiar mix of skepticism and trust. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let's say you're right. How does a middle name help us?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's important." It felt like a password. For the next hour, Ben was silent, his fingers flying across his keyboard. He wasn't looking at storage protocols anymore. He was digging deeper, searching for the initial police and coroner's reports from the Orpheum fire, accessing archived public records that were difficult to find. Finally, he stopped, letting out a low whistle. "Evie," he said, his voice hushed with excitement. "You're not going to believe this." He turned his laptop screen towards her. It was a scanned copy of the original coroner's intake form for the John Doe found at the Orpheum. Most of it was standard procedure, estimated height, weight, cause of death. But at the very bottom, under a section for personal effects found on the body, was a small, typed note. It read, "Partial remains of a leather wallet recovered. Severe fire damage. Fragments of one plastic card suggest identification. Only legible characters are the initials, J.C.C." Evie stared at the screen. J.C.C. Julian Charles Croft. It wasn't a password. It was a fingerprint. A tiny, overlooked clue that had been sitting in a file for 30 years, waiting for someone to know what it meant. A new, daring plan began to form. They now had a fragile but plausible link between the official records and Julian's real name. "This is it," Ben said, his voice buzzing with the thrill of the chase. "This is our way in. You're not just a random person. You are the representative of the estate of the long-lost Croft family. You're searching for a missing family member, Julian Charles Croft, who disappeared in Seattle in the fall of 1991. You have reason to believe this John Doe, identified only by the initials JCC, might be him. And you are formally requesting access to the associated property to search for identifying documents." It was a long shot. It was a bluff built on a ghost's whisper and a fragment of burnt plastic. It would require a performance worthy of an Oscar from Evie and a mountain of official-looking, semi-forged documents from Ben. But it was the only shot they had. 2 days later, they were ready. Ben had created a file of impressive-looking letters and forms. Evie had rehearsed her role, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve. They drove to a bleak, industrial part of the city, pulling up in front of a monolithic, windowless concrete building. A simple sign near the entrance read, City of Seattle Municipal Archives, Annex C. This was the black hole for forgotten things. And somewhere inside its climate-controlled darkness was a leather briefcase that held the key to everything. Evie looked at Ben, her expression grim. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. "You ready for this?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." She got out of the car, smoothed down her professional-looking blazer, and walked towards the imposing steel door, the file of lies clutched in her hand like a shield. She was no longer just a dreamer. She was an executor of a ghost's last will and testament. The interior of the Municipal Archives building was as cold and impersonal as a morgue. The air hummed with the sterile buzz of fluorescent lights and smelled faintly of dust and decay. It was a library of forgotten lives, where the stories had been reduced to case numbers on the spines of identical cardboard boxes. Evie's footsteps echoed on the polished linoleum floor as she approached the service counter, a long, formidable barrier of scratched formica. Behind it sat a woman who looked as though she had been carved from the same granite as the building itself. Her nameplate read, M. Albright. She had sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of severe-looking glasses and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She was the gatekeeper, and she looked utterly unimpressed. "May I help you?" Ms. Albright asked, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. Evie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her own voice steady, channeling the calm, professional executor she was pretending to be. "Yes, thank you. My name is Evelyn Reed. I'm here representing a family estate." She slid the folder Ben had meticulously prepared across the counter. "I'm trying to locate the property of a missing relative who we believe may have died in the city approximately 30 years ago as an unidentified person." Ms. Albright took the folder, her expression unchanging. She opened it and began to read, her eyes scanning the documents with an unnerving efficiency. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Evie could feel a bead of sweat tracing a path down her back. This was the moment. The entire fragile bluff rested on the forged letterhead and carefully chosen legal phrases Ben had spent 2 days crafting. "Julian Charles Croft," Ms. Albright read aloud, her tone skeptical. "And you believe he is the John Doe from the Orpheum Theater fire of 1991? "We have reason to believe so," Evie said, her voice sounding more confident than she felt. "The coroner's report for that case noted the victim's initials were JCC. It's a long shot, but it is the family's only lead after 30 years of searching. We are simply requesting to view the decedent's personal effects to see if there is anything that could provide a positive identification." Ms. Albright looked up from the folder, her sharp gaze pinning Evie to the spot. "Ms. Reed, this is highly irregular. The chain of custody for this kind of property is absolute. We do not allow public access for the purposes of a long shot." She pushed the folder back across the counter. "I'm afraid I can't help you. You'll need a court order." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Evie. It was over. The wall was too high. But then she looked at the gatekeeper's face and decided to abandon the script. She let the mask of the professional executor fall away, allowing the raw, genuine emotion of her quest to show in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "His family never knew what happened to him. They never got to bury him. For 30 years, his story has been a blank page. We're just trying to find an ending. We're just trying to bring him home." She wasn't just acting anymore. She was speaking for Julian, for the boy who died alone in a fire and was erased. Ms. Albright stared at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than bureaucratic indifference crossed her face. A hint of empathy, perhaps. She looked at the file, then back at Evie's desperate, pleading face. She let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a rule being reluctantly bent. "This stays between us," she said, her voice low. "Wait here." Ms. Albright disappeared through a door behind the counter. Evie stood frozen, her legs feeling weak with a mixture of terror and relief. 10 agonizingly long minutes later, the gatekeeper returned. "Come with me," she commanded. Evie followed her into the archives proper. It was a vast, cavernous space, colder than the lobby. Endless aisles of towering metal shelves stretched into the dim distance, each one packed floor to ceiling with identical, numbered cardboard boxes. It was a silent, sprawling cemetery of possessions. Ms. Albright navigated the aisles with practiced ease, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence. Finally, she stopped, running a finger along a row of boxes before pulling one down. The case number from the John Doe fire was scrawled on the side in faded black marker. She led Evie to a small, sterile viewing room containing nothing but a metal table and 2 chairs. She placed the box on the table and, using a small knife, slit the yellowed tape that sealed it. "You have 15 minutes, Ms. Albright said, before taking a position by the door, her arms crossed. Evie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the box, at this final container of a life. With trembling hands, she lifted the cardboard flaps. The contents were meager. A few faded t-shirts, a pair of worn jeans, 3 paperback books. And there, at the bottom, was an old leather briefcase. It was scuffed and worn at the edges, but it was undeniably his. She felt a jolt of recognition, a sense of rightness so profound it almost brought her to her knees. This was Julian's vault. She lifted it out of the box and placed it on the table. It was heavier than she expected, weighted with the secrets it had kept for 3 decades. Ms. Albright watched her, her expression unreadable. This was it. The entire journey, the dreams, the clues, the trip to Astoria, the lies, had all led to this single moment, in this cold, silent room. With her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears, Evie reached for the 2 brass latches on the front of the briefcase, her fingers brushing against the cold, tarnished metal. Everything she was looking for was just a click away. The sound of the brass latches clicking open was like a gunshot in the sterile silence of the viewing room. It felt final, an opening of a tomb. Ms. Albright shifted her weight by the door, her watchful presence a heavy pressure on Evie's shoulders. With a deep breath, Evie lifted the lid of the briefcase. The inside smelled of old paper, leather, and faintly of cedar. It was Julian's vault, a time capsule of a life cut short. On top lay several spiral-bound notebooks, their pages filled with a dense, passionate scrawl, song lyrics, chords, and half-formed poems. Evie's eyes scanned the words, recognizing phrases she had heard in her dreams. It was like reading a transcript of his soul. Beneath the notebooks were mementos, a ticket stub from a jazz concert, a small, smooth stone from a beach, and a folded wallet-sized photo of Amelia, different from the one in the newspaper. In this one, she wasn't performing. She was looking away from the camera, a secret smile on her face, captured in a moment of unguarded joy by the man who loved her. Evie's hands trembled as she carefully lifted each item, her heart sinking a little further with every second. She was looking for a key, but all she found were the mundane, beautiful remnants of a life. Where was it? Could she have misunderstood the dream? The thought sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Ms. Albright cleared her throat, a subtle reminder that her 15 minutes were ticking away. Panic began to set in. Evie ran her fingers along the silk lining of the briefcase, feeling for any lump, any irregularity. Nothing. She felt the pockets on the inside of the lid, finding only a few old pens and a guitar pick. It wasn't here. Defeat, bitter and absolute, began to wash over her. Then, a flicker of an image flashed in her mind, a gift from Julian. It wasn't a full dream, just a ghost of a memory, his hand, pressing firmly into the top corner of the briefcase lid. It wasn't a pocket. It was just the lining. Guided by the phantom touch, Evie pressed her own fingers into that same spot. The lining was smooth, but beneath it, she felt a subtle give, a slight depression where there shouldn't have been one. Her fingernail caught on a single, almost invisible thread. She pulled. A perfectly cut seam in the silk lining opened up, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Her breath hitched. Tucked inside the shallow space was a small object, tightly wrapped in a square of faded chambray cloth. Her fingers were clumsy with adrenaline as she worked it free and unwrapped it. There, resting in the palm of her hand, was a single tarnished brass key. Stamped into the metal was the number she had seen in her dream. 413. It was real. The dream, the number, the key, it was all real. A wave of light-headedness washed over her. She had it. Now came the second terrifying challenge, getting it out of the building. Ms. Albright was watching her like a hawk. She couldn't just slip it into her pocket. She had to create a distraction. With a surge of calculated clumsiness, Evie shifted in her chair, knocking the pile of notebooks and the photograph off the table. They scattered across the floor. "Oh, I am so sorry," she exclaimed, her voice filled with a convincing fluster. Ms. Albright sighed, an irritated puff of air. "Just be careful with the artifacts." As Evie bent down, ostensibly to gather the notebooks, she shielded her right hand from the clerk's view. In one swift, fluid motion, she dropped the key into her low-heeled shoe, the cool metal pressing against the sole of her foot. She gathered the scattered papers, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the other woman could hear it. She placed everything back in the briefcase, her hands now steady. The photo of Amelia, she tucked carefully into her folder. "This photograph," she said, her voice composed. "This is the proof the family needed." "Thank you." It was a plausible reason to have been so moved, a perfect excuse. She closed the lid, the soft click of the latches now sounding like a final farewell. She slid the briefcase back into the box and pushed it across the table. "Thank you, Ms. Albright," Evie said, meeting the woman's gaze. "You have no idea what this means." The clerk gave a curt, non-committal nod and escorted her back to the lobby. Every step was agonizing. The key in her shoe felt as heavy as an anchor, a secret she was smuggling out of the past. The moment the heavy front door of the archives building closed behind her, Evie sagged against the cool concrete wall, gasping for air. She had done it. She walked, trying not to limp, to Ben's car parked down the street. He saw her approaching and his face was etched with anxiety. She pulled the car door open and slid into the passenger seat, the door slamming shut, sealing them in their own private world. "Did you get it?" Ben asked, his voice tense. "Did it work?" Evie didn't answer. She leaned down, pulled off her shoe, and reached inside. She opened her hand and placed the small brass key on the center console between them. The number, 413, seemed to glow in the dim light of the car. Ben stared at it, speechless. All his logic, all his skepticism, was silenced by the undeniable reality of the object in front of them. It was more than a key. It was proof. It was hope. And it was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever touched. The triumph of finding the key was a brilliant, blazing fire that lasted for the entire drive back to Evie's apartment. They had done the impossible. They had reached back 30 years and pulled a physical object from a ghost story into the present. But as they sat at Evie's dining table, the small brass key resting between them like a holy relic, the fire of victory cooled into the cold, hard reality of the next question. "A key is useless if you don't know which door it opens," Ben said, voicing the thought that was settling over them both. "There must have been dozens of banks in downtown Seattle in 1991. We have no idea which one this belongs to." Once again, Ben took the lead on the logical front. His laptop became a time machine, digging through archived business directories, old phone books, and financial records of the era. He mapped out the locations of every bank within a 10-block radius of Julian's apartment and the Orpheum Theater. The list was long and discouraging. Worse, over 3 decades of mergers, acquisitions, and failures had transformed the city's financial landscape. Names like Seattle Metropolitan Savings, Puget Sound Mutual, and Seafirst were now just footnotes in the corporate histories of giants like Chase and Bank of America. "It's a needle in a haystack," Ben sighed after hours of fruitless searching. "Even if we identify the original bank, tracing which corporate entity absorbed its safety deposit box records is another nightmare entirely. We could spend a month on this and get nowhere." They were adrift again, floating in a sea of dead ends. Evie felt the familiar pull of exhaustion and despair. She had the key, but the lock was lost in time. That night, she fell asleep with the key clutched in her hand, a cold metallic plea for guidance. The dream was a soft, sun-drenched memory. It wasn't hers, but she felt it as if it were. She was with Julian, walking hand in hand through Pioneer Square on a rare, perfect Seattle afternoon. The air was warm, and the light filtering through the trees was golden. They weren't talking about anything important, just laughing, their shoulders brushing. Julian stopped at a street vendor and bought a hot dog, which he proceeded to douse in an absurd amount of mustard. As he took a bite, some mustard dripped onto his hand. He laughed, wiping it on a napkin he pulled from his pocket. But it wasn't a plain napkin. It was from a bank. He had clearly been there earlier in the day. Evie's dream self focused on it with an intense, supernatural clarity. It was a simple paper napkin, but embossed on it was a distinctive logo, a stylized, 4-pointed compass rose. Above the logo was the bank's name, Seafarers Trust Bank. Evie woke with the image of the compass burned into her mind. She scrambled for a notepad and sketched it before the details could fade, her heart racing. She showed the drawing to Ben as soon as he arrived with coffee. "I saw it," she said, her voice electric with renewed purpose. The logo of his bank. It was a compass. Ben stared at the sketch. A lesser man would have dismissed it as wishful thinking, but he had learned to trust the impossible truths that came from Evie's sleep. He turned to his laptop and typed in the name she'd given him. Seafarers Trust Bank, he read aloud as the search results populated. Here it is. A regional bank, very popular in the 80s and 90s. Known for its local pride marketing. They were bought out in 1998 by Pacific Northwest Financial. He clicked another link, his eyes scanning the new page. And PNF was then acquired by a larger national bank, Sterling Mutual, in 2005. According to this, Sterling is legally obligated to maintain the records and holdings of all its acquired institutions. Their main downtown Seattle branch is 3 blocks from where we're sitting. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Evie's face. So we just take the key there? It's the right place, Ben said, but he wasn't smiling. His face had gone rigid, his eyes fixed on something he had found on the original Seafarers Trust page. Ben, Evie asked, her own smile faltering. What is it? I was just looking at some of their old archived corporate records, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. From 1991. I was curious who was running the place. He turned the laptop screen towards her. It was a scanned copy of the bank's annual report from that year. On the page was a list of the board of directors. Evie's eyes scanned the names, and then her blood ran cold. About halfway down the list, one name seemed to leap off the page in bold, black letters, Marcus Thorne. She stared at it, the room suddenly feeling airless. It couldn't be. What does it mean? She whispered, though she already knew. It means Julian didn't just pick a random bank to hide the evidence, Ben said, his voice grim. He was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless. He hid the ledger right under the dragon's nose. Thorne wasn't just the owner of the theater. He was a director at the very bank Julian used. He had power there. Influence. The weight of the discovery crashed down on Evie. This changed everything. Their plan to walk into the bank and innocently claim the contents of a long-forgotten box was no longer a simple bureaucratic hustle. It was a direct confrontation. For all they knew, Thorne could have an old alert on that box number. He might have cronies still working within the bank's hierarchy. Walking through the doors of Sterling Mutual wasn't just a trip to the bank. It was stepping into the center of the spider's web. The key in her pocket suddenly felt 1,000 times heavier and 1,000 times more dangerous. The discovery of Marcus Thorne's name on the bank's board of directors hung in the air of Evie's apartment like a toxic gas. The single, tangible key to the entire mystery, sitting on the table between them, now felt like a homing beacon, and they were standing at ground zero. The elation of their success at the archives evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. This is it. This is where we stop, Ben said, his voice low and firm. He stood up and began pacing the small living room, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure anxiety. This is where we go to the police. We tell them everything we know. The story, the fire, Thorne's motive. This is out of our league, Evie. He's not just a ghost from the past. He's a real powerful man, and we are about to walk into his bank. And say what, Ben? Evie countered, her voice sharp with a frustration born of fear. What do we tell them? That my dead dream boyfriend told me a powerful philanthropist is a murderer? We have no proof. We have a story from a woman who's been in hiding for 30 years and a key that we obtained by lying to the city. They'll laugh us out of the station. Or worse, they'll open a preliminary inquiry. Thorne will get tipped off by one of his powerful friends, and that box and whatever's inside it will disappear forever. Our only advantage is that he doesn't know we exist. The second we go to the cops, we lose that. Ben stopped pacing and stared at her. So what's your alternative? We just walk in there. What if he has an alert on that box? What if the bank manager is still one of his guys? We could be walking into a trap. He was right. Her plan to pose as a relative was now suicidal. An inquiry about a box tied to the name Croft could be a death sentence. They were trapped. Going to the authorities was a risk, and going to the bank was an even bigger one. She felt a familiar helplessness, the feeling of being up against a wall too high to climb. That night, sleep was not a refuge, but a strategy session. Julian was there, but the dream was different. There were no romantic walks, no haunted theaters. Instead, she was standing in the lobby of the Seafarers Trust Bank as it was in 1991. It was busy, filled with customers. Julian stood beside her, but he wasn't looking at her. He was watching the tellers. He directed her gaze to one in particular. A young man, barely out of his teens, with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles. He seemed nervous, his movements jerky and unsure, unlike the polished, older tellers around him. As they watched, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit, the bank manager, walked up behind the young teller and said something in his ear, his voice low but menacing. The young man flinched, his face paling, and nodded mutely. He looked trapped. He looked decent. Julian turned to Evie, the memory fading around them. Not everyone is part of the machine, he said, his voice calm and clear. Look for the ones who didn't fit. The dream dissolved. Evie woke up, her mind racing. It was a new path, a brilliant and terrifying one. They didn't have to go through the system. They could go around it. They could find the teller. She described the young man to Ben in frantic detail. He had red hair, freckles, looked like he was maybe 20 years old. He seemed scared of his boss. Julian was showing me that he wasn't one of Thorne's people. He was an outsider. Ben, to his credit, didn't question the source. He simply accepted the new data point and turned to his laptop. Okay, a red-headed bank teller from Seafarers Trust, circa 1991. It's a long shot, but maybe not impossible. For the next several hours, Ben worked his magic. He scoured archived public records, old university yearbooks, and the nascent early 90s version of social media. He searched for employee manifests and payroll records that might have been digitized. It was a painstaking, needle-in-a-haystack search. And then, he got a hit. He found an old staff photo from a Seafarers Trust Bank Company newsletter that had been scanned as part of a local history project. In the back row of smiling employees was a young man with a familiar shock of red hair and a slightly awkward posture. The caption below identified him as Robert Patterson. Robert Patterson, Ben said, his voice hushed. Left the banking industry in 1993. Went back to school, became an accountant. With a few more clicks, he navigated through 30 years of digital breadcrumbs, property records, professional licenses, social media profiles. He lives in Bellevue. Married, 2 kids. Works for a mid-sized accounting firm. He looks normal. Ben looked up from the screen, the gravity of their next move settling over them. They had a name. They had an address. They had a new plan, one that was somehow even more insane than the last. They were about to approach a middle-aged accountant in the suburbs and ask him to help them rob the bank he used to work at 30 years ago, all because a ghost had pointed him out in a crowd. We can't just call him, Evie said, her mind racing. He'll hang up. We have to go see him. In person. Ben nodded slowly, his face grim. This is the biggest risk we've taken yet, Evie. We have no idea who this guy is. He could call the cops. He could call Thorne. I know, she said. But Julian trusted him. And right now, that's all we have to go on. The drive to Bellevue felt like crossing into another dimension. They left the gray, rain-soaked streets of Seattle, with its history and its ghosts, and entered the manicured, orderly world of the suburbs. The houses were pristine, the lawns were emerald green, and a quiet sense of weekend peace hung in the air. It felt deeply wrong to be bringing their dark, violent story into this sanctuary of normalcy. Robert Patterson's house was a modest, 2-story home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. A basketball hoop stood in the driveway, and a child's bicycle lay on its side on the lawn. This was the home of a family, a man who had successfully built a life far away from the secrets of Seafarers Trust Bank. What if he just slams the door in our face? Ben murmured as they walked up the driveway, the words a cloud of nervous breath in the cool air. Then he slams the door, Evie said, though her own heart was a frantic drum. But we have to try. She rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door opened, and a man in his early 50s stood before them. His hair, once a fiery red, had faded to a sandy auburn, and his face was kind, lined with the gentle creases of time. He was wearing a fleece vest and a confused, slightly wary expression. It was him. Robert Patterson? Evie asked, her voice calm and even. Yes, he answered, his eyes flicking between Evie and Ben. Can I help you? My name is Evelyn Reed, and this is Ben Carter, she began, adopting the persona of a serious, official investigator. I know this is going to sound strange, but we're looking into a cold case from 1991. We believe you may have information that could be vital. Robert's posture stiffened. A cold case. I'm an accountant. I think you have the wrong person. He began to close the door. It concerns a young man named Julian Croft, Evie said quickly, stopping the door's movement. He was a customer at Seafarers Trust Bank, where you used to work. The name didn't seem to register. The look on his face was still one of wary confusion. He was about to dismiss them again. Evie knew she had to use the key Julian had given her. Look, she said, her voice dropping, becoming more personal, more intense. We know you were in a difficult position back then. We know you were a good person who saw things that weren't right. And we know that your manager made your life hell because you weren't like the others. Because you didn't fit in. The effect of her words was instantaneous and profound. The color drained from Robert Patterson's face. The vague confusion was replaced by a look of sharp, specific shock. She had reached back 30 years and touched upon a memory he had likely tried to bury for decades. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Who are you? He whispered. We're the people who are finally trying to make it right, Ben said softly. Robert was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. "Come around the back," he said, his voice husky. He led them through a side gate into a tidy backyard with a patio set and a swing set. He gestured for them to sit, then sank into a chair himself, looking not at them, but at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time as the hands of a young, terrified bank teller. There, in the quiet of the suburbs, Evie told him everything. She told him about Julian Croft and Amelia Vance. She told him about the money laundering, the ledger, and the fire. And she told him about the powerful, untouchable Marcus Thorne. As she spoke, a visible transformation came over Robert. He seemed to shrink, the years falling away, leaving behind the scared, freckle-faced kid from the bank. "Thorne," he breathed, the name tasting like poison. "I remember him. He'd come into the bank like he owned it, which I guess he sort of did. He and the manager, Mr. Davies, were always in closed-door meetings. There was a feeling, a wrongness about the place. A culture of fear. Davies was always on my case, watching my every move. I thought it was because I was new, but maybe it was because you had a conscience," Evie finished for him. "Julian saw that. He knew you weren't one of them." Robert finally looked up, a deep, ancient shame in his eyes. "I knew something shady was going on. I put my head down and did my work. I was 20 years old with student loans. I couldn't afford to be a hero. I quit a year later because I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched, of being complicit in something I couldn't name. I ran away." A silence settled over the patio, thick with the weight of 30 years of fear and regret. Then, Evie leaned forward and made her impossible request. "Julian hid the evidence in a safety deposit box at that bank. Number 413, she said. "We have the key, but we can't get to it. Walking in as strangers and asking for a 30-year-old box tied to a John Doe is a suicide mission, especially with Thorne's connection to the bank. But you know the procedures. You know the layout. You were on the inside." Robert stared at her, the full, terrifying scope of what she was asking crashing down on him. She was asking him to risk everything, his career, his family, his safety, to go back into the one place he had run from, to help two strangers and a ghost settle a score with a monster. "You're asking me to help you rob a bank," he whispered, horrified. "We're asking you to help us catch a murderer," Evie replied, her gaze unwavering. Robert looked past her, through the sliding glass door and into his house. On the mantelpiece inside, Evie could see a framed photo of his wife and two smiling children. His safe, quiet, normal life. Everything he had built by putting his head down and walking away. She was asking him to put it all on the line. He looked from his family's photo back to Evie's determined face, his expression a battlefield of fear and conscience. The ghost of the young man he used to be was asking for a second chance to be brave. Robert Patterson stared at the picture of his family, then back at the two strangers on his patio who had brought a 30-year-old ghost to his door. The quiet, orderly life he had so carefully constructed was balanced on a knife's edge. He could say no, and they would leave, and the ghost would perhaps go with them. Or he could say yes, and step back into the fear he had run from his entire adult life. His hands, the steady hands of an accountant, were trembling. "When I was 20, he began, his voice quiet and hoarse, "I used to have nightmares about that bank. About the whispers. About the way Mr. Davies would look at you, like he knew every secret you had. I told myself I was brave for leaving. But I wasn't. I was scared." He finally looked up, and the fear in his eyes was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a flicker of defiance. "I'm tired of being scared." He took a deep breath, the decision made. "Okay," he said. "I'll help you, but we are not robbing a bank. We are going to be smart. We are going to be invisible." The trio formed an unlikely and deeply paranoid planning committee. They met not at Evie's apartment, which felt too exposed, but in the quiet anonymity of a secluded corner of a public park. Robert, in his element with risk assessment and procedure, was a revelation. "Your plan to pose as a relative is out," he stated, his voice all business. "The first flag on a dormant account is an unexpected claimant. But the second flag is a request for a drill out. If a key is presented, and the signature on the access slip matches the signature card on file, the bank employee is just following a routine procedure. No flags are raised." "But we don't have Julian's signature," Ben pointed out. "We can't forge it without a sample." "Exactly," Robert said. "So, we're not going to forge it. Evie is." He looked at her. "You're the artist. You have the best chance of replicating it perfectly. But first, we have to get the original signature card." Robert's plan was a masterpiece of bureaucratic exploitation. The main Sterling Mutual branch downtown keeps the physical records for its acquired banks in a deep storage file room in the sub-basement, he explained, sketching a rough layout on a napkin. It's not a high-security area like the vaults. It's just files. The trick is getting someone down there. The plan was as simple as it was audacious. Robert would call a contact he still had in the bank's administrative department, an old colleague who now managed building services. He would spin a story about needing to recommend a freelance IT auditor to do a preliminary check on their archival server systems, a low-priority task. Ben, with his tech background and professional demeanor, would play the part of the auditor. They'll give you a temporary access badge that gets you into the administrative levels, Robert explained to Ben. That includes the sub-basement. While you're down there, pretending to inspect a server rack, you'll create a minor, harmless distraction. A faulty power strip that trips a circuit, maybe. Something that calls the attention of the single records clerk on duty. That will be Evie's window. Evie would be waiting nearby, in constant, hidden communication with Ben via simple earpiece. During the distraction, Ben would guide her to the records room. Her job was to locate the Seafarer's Trust signature card file for box 413, take a clear photo of it with her phone, and get out, all in less than 2 minutes. Before they could execute their plan, Evie had one more dream. It wasn't a clue or a warning. It was a memory of peace. Julian was sitting at a small desk in his sunlit apartment, the leather briefcase open on the floor beside him. He was writing in one of his notebooks, a look of intense, joyful concentration on his face. He paused, looked up, and seemed to see her across the gulf of time. He didn't speak. He just smiled. It was a smile of gratitude, of trust. It was all the courage she needed. The following morning, they were ready. Ben was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, a fake ID badge Robert had expertly created clipped to his pocket. Evie was in nondescript clothes, a small earpiece, nearly invisible, tucked into her ear. They sat in a car across the street from the imposing glass and steel tower of Sterling Mutual Bank. In the driver's seat, Robert, looking pale and sick with nerves, held a burner phone, ready to coordinate. This was no longer a ghost hunt. It was an infiltration. They were a team of amateurs, guided by a dream, about to walk into the heart of Marcus Thorne's old empire to steal a ghost's signature. Robert took one last, shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the bank's entrance. Okay, Ben. You're up. Try to look like you own the place. He turned to Evie in the back seat. Be ready. The second you hear Ben's signal, you walk in that lobby and head for the elevators. No hesitation. He looked from one to the other, the weight of their insane plan settling on his shoulders. Okay, he whispered, more to himself than to them. Let's go wake up the ghosts. Ben adjusted his tie, gave a curt, professional nod to his two co-conspirators, and stepped out of the car. He walked towards the glass doors of Sterling Mutual Bank with a confidence Evie could only marvel at, a man who looked like he belonged there. From the parked car across the street, Evie and Robert watched him disappear inside, the doors sliding shut behind him. The first piece was in play. An agonizing silence fell over the car, broken only by the soft crackle of the open line in Evie's earpiece. I'm in, Ben's voice whispered, a ghost in her ear. At the security desk. He's calling up to verify my appointment. Robert, in the driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Stay calm. Your contact is legit. They're expecting you. Badge issued, Ben's voice came again. I'm heading for the elevators. They listened to the disembodied sounds of Ben's journey, the chime of the elevator, the soft whoosh of its doors. He narrated his progress in a low, steady whisper. Admin level. Hallway is clear. Taking the service stairs down to the sub-basement as planned. Robert, having memorized his own 30-year-old map, guided him. Stairs will let you out into a long corridor. The records archive is the third door on your left. Server racks are at the far end of the hall. Tell me what you see. Got it, Ben confirmed a moment later. Server room is just a locked cage. Racks are in the main corridor. As predicted, one clerk, sitting at a desk outside the records room. He looks like he's about 12. And he's watching videos on his phone. Perfect, Robert breathed. Evie, get ready. Ben, give the signal when you're in position, Evie whispered, her own voice trembling slightly. Roger that. This was it. Evie's door opened, and she stepped out into the cool morning air. With a final shared look of terror and resolve with Robert, she turned and began the long walk across the street. Each step felt deliberate, heavy. She was a civilian about to walk into a private, secure area of a major financial institution based on a ghost's instructions. As she entered the lobby, a wave of air conditioning and the scent of money washed over her. She ignored the tellers and the security guards, heading straight for the elevators as Robert had instructed, a woman on a mission. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Signal," Ben's voice crackled in her ear, just as the elevator doors slid open. "I'm at the racks." He hasn't even looked up. "Go now." The elevator ride down felt like a descent into the underworld. When the doors opened to the sub-basement, the air was cool and smelled of paper and ozone. The corridor was exactly as Ben had described it. At the far end, she could see him, his back to her, fiddling with a panel at the base of a large server rack. Seated at a desk about 20 feet away was the young clerk, oblivious, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. "Okay, creating the distraction in 5, 4, 3, 2, Ben's voice counted down. Evie flattened herself against the wall, her heart in her throat. 1. With a soft pop and a fizz, the overhead fluorescent lights at the end of the corridor flickered and died, plunging Ben and the server racks into semi-darkness. The clerk at the desk jumped, startled. He looked up from his phone with an annoyed sigh. "Seriously," he muttered to himself, getting up from his desk. He started walking toward the darkened end of the hallway where Ben was now peering at the power strip with a look of professional concern. This was her window. A ghost of a chance. Evie moved, silent as a shadow, slipping past the clerk's empty desk and through the open door of the records room. It was colder inside, the silence absolute. Rows of drab, gray filing cabinets stood in perfect, soulless lines. "Robert, I'm in," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Good," came Robert's tense reply. "Seafarers' trust files should be labeled. Section C. Look for the cabinet marked with AC." Evie's eyes darted around the room, finding the section. "Got it. Third cabinet from the left. Bottom drawer. Go." She pulled the heavy drawer open. It glided out with a low rumble that sounded like thunder in the silence. Inside were thousands of index cards, a sea of forgotten names. Her fingers, numb with adrenaline, flew through them. The box number was her only guide. 390, 400, 410. Then she saw it. A card with the number 413 typed at the top. And below it, the name, Julian Croft. And underneath the name was his signature. It was exactly as she had imagined it, bold, confident, with a slight artistic flourish on the final T. It was a mark he had made, a piece of him that had survived the fire, and seeing it sent a shock of connection through her so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely aim the camera. Just as she was about to take the picture, she heard footsteps in the hall outside. The clerk was coming back. Panic, stark and absolute, seized her. There was nowhere to hide. She flattened herself against the end of the tall cabinet, trying to will herself invisible. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. He was right there. A beat of pure terror passed. Then, the footsteps moved on, heading back to his desk. Not wasting another second, Evie held her breath, steadied her hand, and took 3 clear, perfect photos of the signature card. She slid the card back into its place, closed the drawer as softly as she could, and slipped back out into the corridor. The clerk was at his desk, phone back in hand. Ben was still at the far end of the hall. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod and walked, not ran, back to the service stairs. Minutes later, she was back in the car. Ben slid into the seat beside her a moment after. Robert threw the car into drive and pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into traffic. They didn't speak until they were several blocks away. They had done it. They had infiltrated the dragon's lair and stolen its secret. Evie looked down at her phone, at the picture of Julian's confident, defiant signature. They had the last piece of the key. She looked at Ben, then at Robert in the rearview mirror, her 2 unlikely co-conspirators. Phase 1 was complete. Now, she said, her voice steady and clear, for the performance of a lifetime. The photo of Julian's signature became Evie's obsession. For the next 24 hours, she didn't sleep. Her apartment, which had been a command center, transformed into an art studio dedicated to a single, sacred task. With the focused intensity of a master forger, she practiced. She filled page after page with his name, learning the specific pressure of his pen stroke, the confident loop of the J, the artistic flourish on the final T. She wasn't just copying a signature, she was learning a piece of his soul, channeling his confidence and his defiance. By the next morning, her hand moved with an eerie familiarity, and the signature she produced was a perfect, living echo of his own. The day of the final performance was overcast and gray, a classic Seattle sky. Evie dressed in a simple professional gray suit, her hair pulled back neatly. She was no longer Evie the artist, or Evie the dreamer. She was Evelyn Reed, executor of the Croft estate, a woman of purpose and quiet authority. As she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger, but this time, it was one of her own making. Ben and Robert were waiting in the car, the atmosphere thick with a tense, prayerful silence. Robert handed her a newly forged document, a power of attorney from the Croft estate, authorizing her to access the holdings of Julian Charles Croft. At the bottom was the signature she had spent all night perfecting. It was flawless. "Go to the teller on the far right," Robert advised, his voice a low whisper in her earpiece as she walked into the bank. "She's young, inexperienced. She'll just follow the procedure in the handbook." Evie walked across the marble floor, her footsteps echoing in the vast, cathedral-like space. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, though no one was paying her any attention. She reached the designated teller and smiled, a calm, cool expression she didn't feel. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here to access a safety deposit box. It's quite an old one." She placed the key on the counter. The teller, a young woman who looked barely older than Julian was when he died, took it and examined it. The process that followed was an agonizing, slow-motion ballet of procedure. The teller typed the number into her computer. Her brow furrowed at the dormant status of the account. Evie presented her forged documents. The young woman called over a manager, a stern-faced man who scrutinized the paperwork. Every second felt like an hour. Evie's heart pounded, but her face remained a mask of polite patience. Finally, the manager nodded. "Everything appears to be in order. We'll need your signature on the access slip." This was the moment of truth. With a steady hand, she signed Julian's name, the movement now as natural as her own. The manager compared it to the image of the signature card on his screen. He held it there for an eternity, his eyes flicking back and forth. Then, he nodded again. "Very well. I'll escort you to the vault." The walk to the vault was the longest of her life. They passed through a series of gates, each one opening with a heavy, metallic groan. Finally, they were in a small, private viewing room. The manager returned a moment later with a long, metal box and placed it on the table. He used his key, then hers. With a final, resonant click, the lock disengaged. He slid the box towards her. "You can take as long as you need," he said, before leaving and closing the heavy door behind him, leaving her in complete, utter silence. She was alone with it, with Julian's last will and testament. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a few personal items. His father's silver watch, a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, presumably from Amelia, and a thick, black accounting ledger. She opened it. Page after page was filled with Julian's neat, precise handwriting, detailing coded transactions, offshore accounts, and shell corporations, all linked to Marcus Thorne. It was a meticulous, damning roadmap of a criminal empire, with the Orpheum Theater at its center. This was the proof he had died to protect. She couldn't take the ledger with her. That would be an immediate red flag. Instead, she propped it open and, with methodical precision, used her phone to photograph every single page, ensuring each image was sharp and clear. When she was done, she placed everything back exactly as she had found it, closed the lid, and locked the box. She walked out of the bank and into the gray Seattle air, a free woman carrying a fortune not of money, but of truth. They didn't go to the police. They went back to Ben's apartment, where he helped her compile everything into a single, anonymous, and encrypted file. It contained the high-resolution photos of the ledger, a written transcript of Amelia's testimony, a timeline of their investigation, and a copy of the coroner's report. They sent it to the lead investigative reporter at the Washington Post, a woman known for her fearless pursuit of corruption. Then, they erased every trace of their work and waited. 3 days later, the story broke. The headline was a bombshell that rocked the city to its foundations. Seattle philanthropist Marcus Thorne linked to 30-year-old murder and racketeering ring. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Thorne's empire crumbled. He was arrested, his face of distinguished charm replaced by a mask of snarling disbelief. The news was filled with images of federal agents raiding his offices. In a quiet house in Astoria, Amelia Vance watched the news, a slow, cleansing stream of tears washing away 30 years of fear and guilt. A week later, she drove to a small, forgotten cemetery in Seattle and placed a bouquet of tulips on a grave that, for the first time, had a headstone bearing the name Julian Charles Croft. In a suburban home in Bellevue, Robert Patterson watched the same news report with his family, a quiet, peaceful smile on his face. The ghost in his past was finally at rest, and so was he. And in a busy Seattle coffee shop, Evie and Ben sat across from each other, a laptop open between them, watching the empire of a monster burn to the ground. Their friendship, forged anew in a crucible of secrets and danger, was stronger than ever. That night, for the first time in a long time, Evie dreamed. She was standing in a field of wildflowers under a perfect, cloudless blue sky. Julian was there, standing a short distance away. He wasn't a ghost or a guide. He was just him. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, and in his green eyes, she saw all the words she needed. Thank you. I love you. Goodbye. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, and then turned and walked away, disappearing not into darkness, but into a brilliant, welcoming light. Evelyn Reed woke up to the sound of the Seattle rain, a familiar, steady hiss against her window. But for the first time, it didn't sound like melancholy. It sounded like a promise. She lay there, feeling not the ache of loss, but the quiet, profound peace of a story finally finding its end. The stranger from her dreams was gone, and she was, at long last, gloriously and completely awake.